When I sat down to write the book, of course, the thoughts that came to mind first were thoughts about how the failure of our law in Australia to allow same-sex couples to marry impacts on same-sex couples, first and foremost. And naturally, I would think about that because I am in a same-sex relationship, a very loving and committed one. And so my mind turned to that. It turned to issues of human rights, the fact that I'm not equal under the law because I don't have the capacity to marry my same-sex partner, the fact that my freedom of conscience, my personal autonomy is violated again because I don't have that right. I thought about the practical benefits of marriage to same-sex partners, or to people who can marry. The issue was reinforced for me recently when I received a phone call from the family members of a fellow in Launceston in Tasmania who whose partner of 35 years had died the week before, suddenly. And the bereaved partner was refused access to his dead partner's body. He couldn't go and see the body of his partner in the funeral home or have any say in the funeral arrangements because the dead man's family never accepted the same-sex relationship and they swooped in and claimed next of kin rights. Now, in Tasmanian law, they don't have those rights, but of course it was very difficult for the bereaved partner to prove immediately, right there on the spot, that he is the one with those rights. And if he had that marriage certificate, that piece of paper which said that their relationship is recognised by the state, all of that trauma could have been avoided. I thought about the messages that are sent out by the failure of the law to allow me to marry my partner, if I wish. Messages about the quality of the love and commitment in same-sex relationships, that quality isn't the same as the love and commitment associated with marriage. And most of all, probably the most important thing for me, is the issue of inclusion. That marriage is about being included in your family, in the community, in society broadly, because of the recognition of marriage, because our language of love and commitment is couched so much in the terms associated with marriage: husband, wife, spouse, brother-in-law, mother-in-law. And that to fully belong means to have that capacity to marry. That marriage brings together not just partners, but families, friends. Like love itself, marriage bridges boundaries and overcomes divisions. And there was one person who I quoted in the book who expressed that, I think, better than anyone else. And I'll just read you what he wrote. This was a submission to the inquiry into same-sex marriage done in the Senate last year. The person who wrote this, his name is Frederick Weisinger, and he's an elderly gentleman who lives in Sydney. I have been in a happy relationship for 38 years. My partner and I were both migrants arriving to Australia in the 50s. We were a controversial pair. He was German and I was Jewish, who not so long before spent my childhood and adolescence in a concentration camp. Yet we overcame a great obstacle because we have found love was stronger than hate. We built our lives together. We brought family to Australia, who in turn prospered and had families of their own. We lived in the same house we bought and had a wonderful relationship with our neighbours and people at large. Our foundation was solid. We did not shake any heterosexual foundations. We would have loved to be married and be part of society instead of outsiders. I think that in a more enlightened world, there should be more understanding and tolerance of people of the same sex to be allowed to marry and live equal to heterosexuals. With the staggering number of divorces around me, I wonder how much stronger our foundation was by comparison. So for me, as a gay man in a loving relationship, all of those issues came first to mind, and that's what I wrote about. But today, I think it's important that we turn our minds to something slightly different. Issues that have sometimes been ignored in this debate. How the issue of marriage equality for same-sex partners affects people who aren't gay or not particularly concerned with human rights. I think what brings this into focus for me in the last few days is the announcement that you would have seen in The Age that the new Labor candidate in this seat of Melbourne strongly supports marriage equality. I think that's a very important step forward. It's a bit of a contrast to many other Labor candidates who aren't yet willing to declare their support for that reform, even though polls show a majority of them do. And certainly it's contrast to our new Labor leader, Gillard, who said that she personally opposes the reform. But it also reinforces the perception, the misperception, that marriage equality only matters in the inner city, where there are large numbers of gays and lesbians and political progressives. In reality, the failure of our government to allow same-sex couples to marry is something which should profoundly concern all Australians. And here's why. Firstly, because a majority of us, that is Australians, support marriage equality. Polling shows that 60% of Australians believe the Marriage Act should be reformed to allow same-sex couples to marry. That includes a majority of voters of both the Labor and Liberal parties, a majority of women and men, a majority of white and blue-collar workers, and a majority in virtually every age group. It's also an issue that supporters are passionate about. The inquiry in the Senate last year that I've already mentioned received 11,000 submissions in favour of reform, more than any other Senate inquiry ever. These submissions, again, came from across the country, and if the samples I've looked at are anything to go by, the overwhelming majority were from heterosexuals. Yet despite this, both major parties remain blithely ignorant to the issue. They don't want to talk about it, they're not interested, they don't want to support it. They're not listening to the majority of Australians, and that's not healthy for our democracy. What would be healthy is if the majority view of Australians was recognised. Two, because of the wider impact of inequality. One of the reasons that this reform has popular support in Australia is because more and more heterosexual Australians know a gay or lesbian person as a family member or a friend or a work colleague, and have some experience of what marriage discrimination means through that acquaintance. From the submissions to the Senate inquiry last year, it became clear to me that there were two groups in particular for whom this discrimination is really raw. First, those families whose loved ones marry overseas because they can't marry here. Australian marriage equality is estimated that 2,000 Australians have entered into same-sex marriages in Canada. If we double that, that's a conservative estimate, if we double that for the world as a whole, that's about 4,000 families, including parents and grandparents and uncles and aunties and cousins and friends, who have been deprived by Australia's discriminatory marriage law of the joy of having their loved one marry at home. Second, the children of same-sex couples, who want and deserve the legal security and social recognition that's associated with marriage. Most Australians, I think, would agree that no Australian child should be treated differently or denied opportunities because of the sexuality or gender of their parents. Another person I quote in the book was Elizabeth Murray, and she sums this up really well. I lived with my mum and her same-sex partner from the age of 10. I could not have had a better set of parents. They are my role models when it comes to how a long-term relationship should look. And I hope my husband and I are as happy as they are when we've been together for 20 years. Yet these women who I love dearly are denied the opportunity to legally marry. They came to my wedding and celebrated with me, yet I cannot celebrate the same happy occasion with them. Their union is like a marriage in every sense, so why are they denied that legitimacy? Why was I denied the legitimacy of my parents being married? Again, this isn't an isolated case. By conservative estimates, there are 10 or 20,000 children in this country who do not have the same opportunities as their counterparts thanks to a single discriminatory law. These Australians who feel the impact of marriage inequality, though they are mostly heterosexual, live in regional as well as urban Australia. They are people of faith and no faith. They vote across the political spectrum. What they share is a sense that an injustice has been inflicted on them, as well as their gay and lesbian family members and friends. Third reason, because marriage equality challenges the disproportionate religious influence in Australian politics. As much as they try to hide their religious views behind dodgy science or appeals to biological determinism, most advocates against marriage equality are motivated by a belief that God ordained marriage and homosexuality is a sin. But most Australians do not agree that the Bible is the basis for marriage law. We allow divorce although Jesus prohibited it, and we prohibit polygamy although the Old Testament is full of it. We don't bat an eyelid at atheists marrying, or Christians not marrying, or indeed at Prime Ministers who are unmarried atheists. No longer do most Australians marry in churches, so why should we as a nation allow Bronze Age prejudices to determine whether same-sex partners should marry? One of the reasons marriage equality should matter to all Australians is that achieving this reform will help redraw the line that properly divides civil law and religious values in a secular, multi-faith democracy, firmly setting the law on a foundation of human reason and need, not divine revelation and wrath. 4, because marriage equality should be supported by conservatives and Christians, as well as progressives and non-believers. Some conservatives, those who have left behind the rigid extremism that tends to be exhibited sometimes on the right in the Western world, and have gone back to conservatism's more pragmatic roots, have pointed out that allowing same-sex couples to marry is important because it strengthens traditional family values like love, fidelity, responsibility and mutuality. The Bush-appointed former US Solicitor General, Ted Olson, who was also an advocate in a recent federal court case in the United States about same-sex marriage, an advocate for equality, believes same-sex marriage is about, quote, the values conservatives prize, because, and to quote him, marriage requires thinking beyond one's own needs. It transforms two individuals into a union based on shared aspirations, and in doing so establishes a formal investment in the well-being of society. The fact that individuals who happen to be gay want to share in this vital social institution is evidence that conservative ideals enjoy widespread acceptance. Similarly, those Christians who have moved beyond reflexive fundamentalism have argued that marriage equality is critical to freedom of religion. In a nutshell, those faiths which solemnise same-sex marriages in Australia are, for instance, the Quakers, some progressive synagogues, are not allowed the same legal recognition for this religious practice as those faiths which only solemnise opposite-sex marriages, which are the big mainline churches. In explaining his support for marriage equality, the Melbourne pastor, Reverend Nathan Nettleton, said this: "The doctrine of separation of church and state, for which some of my Baptist forebears endured violent persecution, teaches us firstly that it is a Christian duty to defend the right of others to follow their own conscience, free from coercive attempts to impose conformity, and second, that the state should not privilege the convictions of any particular religious tradition over another, including a majority tradition." 5, because the pace of reform overseas threatens to embarrass this country. In the last few weeks, Portugal, Mexico City and Iceland have joined Holland, Belgium, Spain, Canada, South Africa, Sweden, Norway and 6 US states from Massachusetts to Iowa in allowing same-sex couples to marry. The number of places where same-sex marriages are either soon to be allowed or already recognised from other countries is even larger, ranging from Argentina through Slovenia and Israel to Nepal. In the World Cup of marriage equality, Australia hasn't even made the first round. Increasingly, Australians are asking, if it can happen in Portugal and if it can happen in Iowa, why can't it happen here? Many feel discomfort that our image of tolerance doesn't match reality. Overseas, more and more people are asking why Australia is falling behind. At some point, these questions will turn to jokes about Australian homophobia, in exactly the same way that we're taunted now for our supposed racism. I can just see a latter-day version of that famous Monty Python sketch about the Bruces and their jokes about poofters all over again. Of course, it hasn't reached that stage yet, but if the Marriage Act is not reformed, our national reputation will inevitably suffer. 6, and finally, because same-sex marriage benefits marriage as a whole. For the last 200 years, those who declared marriage to be an archaic institution about to wither away were wrong, were proven wrong, again and again. Similarly, those who have repeatedly declared that marriage will be destroyed if it is reformed in any respect at all have also been proven completely wrong. The truth is that marriage is both a critical and a durable part of our society, and like all social institutions, it must reform to stay relevant. Imagine if marriage was the same institution today that it was 100 years ago, when wives had no rights, divorce was almost impossible, and interracial marriages were banned. No one would want to get married. In the same way, as society becomes more accepting of same-sex relationships, the current prohibition on same-sex marriages will come to be seen as anachronistic, and the institution of marriage as a whole will increasingly be seen as an instrument of prejudice rather than a symbol of love. I mean, I know this myself, going to wedding ceremonies now and hearing that famous line, marriage, which all celebrants have to say during the ceremony, marriage in Australia is the union of one man and one woman for life to the exclusion of all others. To the exclusion of all others is meant to be a statement about commitment and fidelity. But in the ears of more and more people going to marriage ceremonies in Australia, it's not a statement of fidelity, it's a statement about prejudice. To the exclusion of all others reminds people and reinforces in their mind that people like me cannot get married. No Australian who is married, no Australian who has ever dreamt of marrying wants marriage to become a fossil, petrified by the prejudices of the past. In some way or another, virtually every Australian has a stake in allowing same-sex couples to marry, whether they are touched by discrimination against their gay family members, uphold democratic and secular principles, value Australia's reputation, or just value marriage. Each Australian should be profoundly concerned about the way successive federal governments have entrenched and defended discrimination. The key to achieving marriage equality in this nation is to alert our fellow Australians to how the issues affect them. Supporters of reform have no Bill of Rights to ensure legal equality and no citizens' referenda so that people's will can prevail. All we have is the power of persuasion and the sense of decency and fairness in the hearts of those to whom we appeal. Such appeals have worked before. In the 1960s, millions of people in both the United States and Australia were moved by stories of interracial couples denied the freedom to marry who they loved. Moved not only to oppose laws banning interracial marriages, but racial segregation generally. It is my conviction that the stories we tell today about the pain and hardship caused by not allowing same-sex couples to marry will also have the potential to motivate millions. and to become metaphors for a better future for everyone. While marriage equality is about many things, it is fundamentally about love, and there is nothing and no one love cannot move. Thank you.